Thus far, we've been focusing the program on having candid and courageous discourse or conversations. This type of conversation is especially necessary in the halls of power, whether that's in the government, in the military, or even in business. Exploring the parameters of the marketplace of ideas often brings out and upgrades the quality of decision making. But sometimes these conversations turn to the notion of speaking truth to power. That is, having the moral courage to express principled dissent. Nowhere is that more important than in the civil-military relationships in our country, especially in wartime. Now, the overall discourse between the military and civilian leaders is governed by the Constitution of the United States. Several sections in the Constitution in Article 1 and 2 establish that relationship. It's established in U.S. Code Title 10. It's established in the military officers' commissioning oath and in long-standing professional military ethics. Military subordination to civilian control is both the central legal and governing ethical norm for our military. Harmonizing politics and military professionalism is at the heart of candid and courageous discourse within and throughout the chain of command. But what about the appropriate bounds of behavior when there are irreconcilable differences in judgment between civilian and military leaders? So our next three panelists will address this topic from multiple perspectives. Our first panel will explore speaking truth to power at the nexus of the civilian and military hierarchies at the highest levels. Our third speaker will address the issue of truthfulness when speaking truth to power at the junior officer level. Now, to set the context for this afternoon's conversations, I want to refer you to the notion of the so-called Revolt of the Generals, which occurred during the early stages of the Iraq War. So to provide you some context for the remarks of the speakers and to help frame your questions later on, I'd like you to watch the following video.
The Generals Revolt, as it's commonly called, in 2006, where 8 generals asked for your resignation. How personal? How did it play out?
Well, it got a lot of press, and I don't know how many retired generals and admirals there are, but there have to be thousands. And 8 of them decided to use politics and make a statement. Some of them then went up and worked with the Democrats in the Senate and had a hearing, a pretend hearing.
Right before Thanksgiving, the president, after a routine NSC meeting, took Rumsfeld aside and they went into a little cubby hole off the Situation Room, and the president closed the door and asked Rumsfeld, "What war plans do you have for Iraq?"
Rumsfeld believed all the Pentagon's war plans were cumbersome and outdated.
And the president said, well, he wanted to examine those specifically for Iraq.
4-star General Tommy Franks was in charge.
The challenge here for Rumsfeld is he's got a guy who comes really out of the classic Army background, who's going to think, yep, let's go in big and heavy.
General Shinseki and Secretary of the Army White had no operational authority over specific war plans. This would be a game of one-on-one, Rumsfeld against Franks. The most recent Iraq War plan, based on the success of Desert Storm, called for overwhelming force, weeks of heavy air bombardment, and 7 months advance warning. General Shinseki's position was Army doctrine. Large numbers of forces were necessary to secure a country immediately after a conflict. But he couldn't get through to Rumsfeld, who had Newt Gingrich talking to less traditional planners like Colonel McGregor.
But Franks wants still several 100,000 troops to go in. And Rumsfeld has this process where he kind of chips away at this belief, asking questions. Why do you need that? Why do you need that? The Pentagon dubs this the iterative process. But it really, I think, is more a process of erosion.
Franks sided with Rumsfeld. I think one thing that people underappreciate is even if you're a four-star, and even if you have disagreements with your civilian boss, when the boss rules, which he does in our society, you're going to be a good soldier and go along with that, and you're not going to show the public that there's any dissent.
Just 3 weeks before the invasion of Iraq was to begin, General Shinseki was forced to take his internal fight with Secretary Rumsfeld public.
General Shinseki, could you give us some ideas to the magnitude of the Army's force requirement for an occupation of Iraq following a successful completion of the war?
In specific numbers, I would have to rely on combatant commanders' exact requirements, but I think...
How about a range?
I would say that what's been mobilized to this point, something on the order of several 100,000 soldiers are probably, a figure that would be required. We're talking about post-hostilities, control over a piece of geography that's fairly significant with the kinds of ethnic tensions that could lead to other problems, and so it takes a significant ground force presence.
As the pressure for Congress to stand up to the president increases in Washington, a second front opened today outside the Beltway with an unprecedented event in the history of this war. For the first time, former generals who actually served in Iraq are appearing in advertisements criticizing the commander-in-chief, his handling or mishandling of the war, and congressional hesitancy to take greater control.
The President is not well served by this Secretary of Defense, a man history will not treat kindly. So what to do? Replace the Secretary of Defense with a proven leader who has a vision to get the country's defense establishment back on track. The Army is in terrible shape. The Marines are not much better. A Secretary who understands how to build alliances at home and abroad, who understands the operational art and understands the contemporary operating environment we live in.
There were two issues about enough troops. One was enough troops for the major combat, and a lot of people said we didn't have it, and obviously we did. And there was a very difficult balance that had to be struck between surprise, which meant a smaller force, and enough troops, or a lot of troops, which meant a much slower and with potential of many disastrous consequences. And I don't know whether they would have happened or not. Things like the destruction of the oil fields, but also things that probably wouldn't have happened but we feared, like the use of chemical weapons. The other enough troops issue is enough troops for the afterwards, and I think on that point, yeah, we were clueless on counterinsurgency. I think I said in my comments, quoting Doug's book, no one anticipated this insurgency. A lot of people were very slow to recognize it once it had started. And I do think that a real failure, and you can assign responsibility all over the place, was not having enough reliable Iraqi troops early enough and fast enough, because I think a sensible counterinsurgency strategy wouldn't have been to flood the country with 300,000 Americans, but rather to build up the Iraqi forces to be able to protect the population much more quickly.
Having framed out some of the issues about speaking truth to power, our first panelist will be a familiar name to many of you. Dr. Eliot Cohen is the Robert E. Osgood Professor of Strategic Studies at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. He served in the U.S. Army Reserve, was a director in the Defense Department's policy planning staff, led the U.S. Air Force's multi-volume study of the First Gulf War, and has served in various official advisory positions. From 2007 to 2009, he served in the Department of State as Secretary Condoleezza Rice's senior advisor, focusing chiefly on issues of war and peace, including Iraq and Afghanistan. His public commentary appears in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and on major television networks. He is a contributing editor to The Atlantic, and he is the author of several books, including the widely acclaimed Supreme Command, Soldiers, Statesmen, and Leadership in Wartime. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dr. Eliot Cohen.
Okay, so the military should take over the government. I just wanted to see if you were awake. No, the military should not take over the government. That was just to make sure everybody's awake after lunch. Colonel Gray, thank you for that introduction. I will note that I'm speaking to an audience of young people who were probably up at 5:30 this morning doing PT. They've been in a windowless room, and you've just fed them a large meal of beef and chicken, and there is no coffee. So all that stuff about setting up subordinates to succeed, that doesn't seem to have been part of the program. Okay, I'm going to try to keep you awake. The theme, one of the things we're talking about is speaking truth to power. And I want to say something about that, and then actually what I'm going to do is address, untypically for a professor, I'm going to address the 5 questions that I was given. But first, something about speaking truth to power, because that is what we're discussing. It is a value. It is sometimes a moral imperative. In my case, as counselor of the Department of State, it was a job, but perhaps most importantly of all, it is a skill. And so I'd ask you to file away the following story. Shortly after I arrived at the State Department, I was talking to my colleague, Dave Gordon, who was head of the policy planning staff. And you have to understand, the job of the counselor, and this is why Condoleezza Rice hired me, is frequently to tell her things she doesn't want to hear. And Dave said to me, speaking truth to power, huh? He said, well, speaking truth to power every couple of months in an op-ed, that's pretty good. If, however, you speak truth to power every day and face-to-face, power gets seriously ticked off. And that's true. There's an art to speaking truth to power. And the problem with this topic is it can lend itself to a certain kind of moral posturing where you may feel fine, but actually you're not helping the person you're trying to help or the system you're trying to help. And we can revisit that a little bit later on. So I was asked to address 5 questions. I'm just going to go through them. The first is, we've seen repeated clash of cultures between the military leaders and politicians. Why does that happen? I would give you 2 big reasons for that. The first, the most important, is it is inevitable. I hope on July 4th you all read the Declaration of Independence out loud, and that when you do it, you don't just read the inspiring paragraph or 2 at the beginning, but you read the Bill of Particulars. All the stuff at the end where they say, we've got to give you the exact reasons why we've had it with King George III. And you will be struck by how much of that is about the military, in this case, the British military. And it begins with this statement, he, King George III, has effected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. in a democratic system, but particularly in our democratic system, given where we came from, given how these colonies were created, given what their history was, a certain degree of civilian suspicion of the military is in our political DNA. And in fact, that's not even necessarily a bad thing, at least when it takes the form of a healthy skepticism. So that's the most important thing to remember. But the other thing is, this is the nature of war, that there will be a clash of cultures. There will be what I call in Supreme Command an unequal dialogue, unequal but hopefully a dialogue, and it will be filled with tension and disagreement and disputes, and that's a good thing. There are two 20th century cases where it didn't happen and the military was given the war to run the way it wanted to. The first is Germany in World War I, and the second is Japan in World War II. And neither of those cases turned out particularly well for those countries. More profoundly, as we know from Karl von Clausewitz's On War, war is a branch of politics. What Clausewitz says is it's not just that war is triggered by political events, not that just that it's launched by politicians or ended by politicians, but rather, he says, a true political instrument. It is a thoroughly political activity. That can pose some real dilemmas for those of you who are going to be serving officers. That already sets up a whole bunch of tensions, because you probably don't think of yourselves as being particularly political, but you will be engaged in a political activity. And that, again, is going to set up conflicts. There will be tensions between what military leaders believe is tactically right, doctrinally right, and what politicians want. And politicians, however, have the dominating voice, not only because that's the form of government under which we live, but because that actually is in accordance with what is the nature of war. Let me give a famous case from perhaps the most famous product of this institution, George C. Marshall dealing with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. As you may know or recall, the United States faced a major strategic choice in 1942 after we come into the war. Do we build up in Europe, particularly in Great Britain, and launch an invasion of France in 1943? Or, as the British were suggesting, invade North Africa in 1942? And this causes a tremendous internal debate over the summer of 1942, and the decision is made to launch Operation Torch, the North Africa landings. George Marshall and his naval counterpart, Ernest King, were deeply opposed to this. They knew that if you did this, if you went down this route, you would not be able to invade France in 1943, and in their view, that was the only way to really take Germany out of the war. Roosevelt came back and he said, I understand your position, but here's the thing. Our strategy is we focus first on Germany, and Japan is the secondary opponent. That's what our plans are based on. But the war started, from our point of view, in the Pacific with the attack on Pearl Harbor. So for that reason, for political reasons, we have to have substantial American forces engaged in combat in the European theater within a year of the beginning of the war. And he basically issues the order, signing it, as he always did, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Commander-in-Chief, just to make sure everybody knew who was in charge. What's so interesting about this are two things, really. The first is Marshall was interviewed after the war about this decision. He still hated it. He still hated it. And he said to his interviewer, I guess I didn't understand the need to keep the American people entertained in wartime. I wish I could find a nicer way of putting it, but I just can't. Even Marshall, who really was a remarkable military leader and who was in some ways politically very shrewd. But right there you have the clash between two very different perspectives. Marshall the consummate professional, Roosevelt the consummate politician. There's another little point in there. Most historians agree Marshall was wrong. It would have been disastrous to attempt to invade France in 1943 before the Luftwaffe had been defeated, before the United States Army had gone through a shakedown campaign in North Africa. But it's an important episode. I would say this culture clash became particularly acute in the period following the first Gulf War, and that had to do with a number of things, but part of it was the enormously high prestige that the United States military had after the first Gulf War, the crystallization of a certain conception of what war was, particularly the imperative of very short wars, a certain kind of disdain for irregular warfare, which I did a study for the Defense Policy Board in the early phases of the Iraq War, just looking at our doctrinal manuals for counterinsurgency. They were all from Vietnam, literally, all from Vietnam, until the new one was written by Dave Petraeus and Jim Mattis. And I think that created a particular set of conditions that was conducive to a clash. But the main point I want to leave you with is that sort of clash is inevitable. Second question, which is related, is, well, why don't civilians and soldiers have the same theory of war? Again, many, many reasons. But the most fundamental is they are very different kinds of people. Most of us in this room could not be elected dog catcher. Me too. That's why I'm not a politician. I'm a professor. That's why most of you will become military officers and not politicians. Being a politician is a very, very different walk of life, and it doesn't appeal to most of us. It attracts people with very different upbringings, outlooks, and life experiences. And yes, there are crossovers. I fully understand that. But the life experiences you get are different. And here's one way in which the life experiences are profoundly different. The higher up you go in the military, the more deference you get, the more aides, the nicer office, the more likely you are to have a G5 to fly you around, the amount of external respect that you will be shown. The higher up you go in politics, the more abuse you're going to take. Every day. Social media, newspaper, the opposition, it just gets nastier and nastier. And it's even worse in parliamentary systems than in a mixed system like ours. You want to see brutal? Go look at Prime Minister's questions in the House of Commons, where the Prime Minister is being subjected to unrelenting criticism and abuse by the opposition, and he or she has to take it and dish it out as good as they, or indeed better, than they receive. Those are very, very different life experiences, very different attitudes, and they create different expectations about how you treat people and how you expect to be treated. Now, by the way, there are counterexamples, and those are important. Bear in mind, in part as a corrective, bit of a corrective to that video, if you go further on in the Iraq War, if you were to look at, say, the relationship between General Petraeus and President Bush, or General Petraeus and Secretary of Defense Gates, very much the same theory of that particular war. Very much the same theory, very much on the same page. And on the whole, remarkable mutual understanding. In a somewhat lesser vein, somebody who we don't usually think of as having a particularly good relationship with the military, President Obama, the basic outlines of the campaign against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria laid out by General John Allen, who had his share of frictions with the Obama administration, but on the whole, the same theory of the case of how to fight that war. So there are counterexamples. Third question was, well, what about general officers speaking out? When should they do it and how? And I think General Newbold, for whom I have a very high regard, will have a different view, but let me give you mine. Let me begin by saying this is a live issue. I was recently talking to a fairly senior general officer who put the odds of going to war in Korea at 1 in 2. He shares my view of it, which is that this is not a good idea. That there's an alternative between that and simple humiliation, but we're stuck with something in the middle. Well, this is a live issue for a lot of general officers. What do I do about a Korean War, which I might think is really dumb? So, speaking out, I would say in private, absolutely. In fact, there I would say it is a moral imperative. It is an obligation to tell the president this is a bad idea, if you think it is a bad idea, or this plan will not work, or we have under-resourced this. Publicly, I don't think so. Now, the one partial exception, and General Shinseki, I think, fell into this, is, well, what do you do about Congress? Our system is unusual in that it sets up a inevitable conflict in which general and flag officers always find themselves caught and impaled, and that's tension between Congress asking a very direct question. You've got to give them an honest answer, but you're also part of the administration, and you're supposed to be a loyal member of the team. And we can talk perhaps about how you navigate that. But in terms of public opposition, including this so-called revolt of the generals, bad idea. Why do I think it's a bad idea? First, it is a political act. It is a political act. As soon as you take on a senior civilian official, be it the president or the secretary of defense, you are now engaged in politics, and you're using the prestige of your rank to do that. It will be interpreted as that by everybody. The political opposition will use it, and the sitting administration will see it as a political act. Secondly, in a variety of ways, I believe it undermines good order and discipline. Why do the generals get to speak out publicly, but not the majors? I'm the father of one major and one Navy lieutenant. They don't get those choices, nor should they. And I am not always of the view that generals should have privileges that the majors don't have. One thing that is striking about our system is the extent to which, and Dr. Wong may wish to speak to this as well, we put our general and flag officers on much more of a pedestal than, say, the British or the Israelis do, and it's not a good thing. Finally, it doesn't help. Again, little addition to that film. I can tell you, because I had a certain kind of window into the Bush administration at that time, the revolt of the generals probably delayed Donald Rumsfeld's resignation as Secretary of State. It delayed it. Because the last thing a president of the United States is going to do is say, yes, 8 generals have come out publicly against my Secretary of Defense, so therefore I'm going to fire him. No, instead what he says is, I'm going to show you who's in charge, and stuck with him. And although the story of Donald Rumsfeld is a very mixed story, I would say it was unfortunate because he had actually offered his resignation before. It probably would have been better for President Bush to have taken it earlier, but he didn't. And my view is that was because of the revolt of the generals. Should the public trust the military more than civilians? Well, I would say it depends on what. It depends on what. Remember, the often disagree. In my book, Supreme Command, I talk about how Premier Clemenceau of France, a 70-year-old doctor, finds these 2 field marshals, Philippe Pétain and Ferdinand Foch, with completely opposite understandings of how he should fight the final phase of the First World War. There is no uniform military expertise which kind of coalesces on a decision. And again, a bit of a corrective to that movie, they weren't just listening, they were listening in part to people like Newt Gingrich, they're also listening to people like General Jack Keane, particularly when you go to the Surge decision. And political leaders will, by nature, because they tend not to want to rely on a single person, they don't, because they're not particularly trustful people, and they don't particularly understand this chain of command stuff, they will reach out. That's just what they're going to do. And they will find serious differences in military opinion. It is possible, moreover, for the military to be wrong. It's possible for the military to be wrong. President Truman was told that racial integration would do enormous damage to the American military. And whether Harry Truman thought he was wrong or he thought he was right and just didn't care, in that case, pretty clearly, his military advisors were wrong. That can happen. Finally, it's important to remember two things about politicians. The first is a politician's viewpoint is almost by definition a bigger picture. It could be a bigger picture of coalition warfare, it could be a bigger picture about domestic politics, it could be a bigger picture about who the enemy is, but it is a somewhat bigger picture. But above all, most importantly, the politicians are ultimately the ones responsible. They're fundamentally the ones responsible. So, if we may end up talking about the Iraq War, and there are plenty of things one can criticize about the American military's handling of it, but I would say, and I said at the time in public, the people who are responsible, the civilian leaders, the President and the Secretary of Defense. Well, last question is, how do you create the right environment? I think there are two things here. First, it's important to accept and indeed embrace the likelihood of lively disagreement. And this is absolutely on the politician's back to create an environment where that can happen, where people are expected to argue and disagree and they make decisions. Again, many politicians actually, when you get to military matters, they want consensus because some of these decisions are very scary decisions. And it's easier for them if they're getting unanimity. But it is on them to create an environment where people can disagree and argue. But, and I think this is really important to remember, particularly if you ever get to that level, that doesn't mean that it's a comfortable environment. It can be an extraordinarily stressful environment. Again, for those of you who are interested in these things, read the chapter on Churchill dealing with his generals in Supreme Command. It was not fun being Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, who was always arguing with Churchill. He took out his rage every night in a diary, which unfortunately he later published, which didn't do his reputation any good. But it was stressful. It was stressful. And in this way, I would say it's a little bit different from the kind of civil discourse that we've been talking about this morning, because you are talking about disagreements about the most serious kinds of issues, issues of life and death, issues of enormous consequence for the country. You shouldn't expect those discussions to be emotionally easy. And this final point I would make is, for their part, it's more important that the generals be willing to be fired than that they be willing to quit. That is to say, that they will be persistent in advancing their view, although there comes a point, as there undoubtedly came a point in Colonel Gray's brigade headquarters where his subordinates might say something and he'd say, I hear you, I've still made a decision and we're going to go ahead. That's just part of the military decision-making environment. But I have to tell you, having seen generals interacting with politicians, they are not always willing to be really courageous and looking the president squarely in the eye and saying, you're wrong. Nobody finds that easy. Nobody finds that easy. I think once in my life, and I've been in rooms with presidents on a number of occasions, once in my life I was able to do that, and it was probably the hardest thing I ever did. But that's part of the duty, I think, of any senior official in the United States government, but particularly general officers. So now that I think you're still all awake, let me stop there and hand the stage back over to Colonel Gray.
What you learn next distinguished speaker demonstrated candor and moral courage throughout a long and distinguished military career. Lieutenant General Gregory Newbold served as a Marine infantryman and commanded units from the platoon level all the way up to the 1st Marine Division. He also served in various other staff assignments in the Marine operating forces in the United States and overseas. He served as a military assistant to the Secretary of the Navy, and on his final tour as Director of Operations, J3, for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. As the Pentagon's top operations officer in 2002 and 2003, he voiced his principled dissent over the planning of the Iraq War. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lieutenant General Gregory Newbold.
I feel like I'm attending an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. Hi, my name's Newbold, and I'm a revolting general. I really enjoyed Dr. Cohen's remarks. I thought they were excellent. And I really appreciate the fact that Colonel Gray invited me. Must not have been easy. It's a very difficult polemical issue, speaking truth to power. You had the additional hurdle to overcome inviting a Marine to speak on the subject, the danger of infecting cadets. And he undoubtedly heard that there's good reason why when I taught tactics, they called me Captain Unequal, because I put people to sleep so often. So I agree with Dr. Cohen. It's a difficult hour, but I will try to impart some observations that'll help you. I have great affection for this institution, VMI. It's my 3rd time speaking here. The standards, the expectations, the traditions, and the customs of VMI are noteworthy, and I'm a great fan. I am a little dismayed by the football score last weekend with the Citadel. But take heart. What you'll remember most about your experience here is not how you fared against the Citadel. There are other schools which obviously place a much higher priority on their sports teams. I'm reminded of a story I heard recently about Auburn football team. Very successful program. Incredible athletes. One of them was not just a great football player, but competed in the Olympics, won a gold medal, was so proud of it he had it bronzed. So don't worry about your football team. There's another thing that you ought to be very proud of, and that's your honor code. There are a lot of institutions, particularly among the American military, that have an honor code. None of them are as stringent as VMI's. None of them have a drum-off, such as you've had already this year. The expectations and the standards are very high. A cadet will not lie, cheat, steal, nor tolerate those who do. So if a cadet taking a physical fitness test alleged 20 pull-ups and only did 10, if a cadet lied about coming in off late to come back onto the compound, if a cadet cheated, they wouldn't be tolerated. They'd be drummed off. Because honor and character are preeminent in the formation of an officer for the U.S. military. Let's talk about that. Let's extend it from this institution to a civilian example recently. Harvey Weinstein, the movie mogul. If the counts are correct, a sexual predator, rapist, And how was it allowed to exist for all those years, that kind of abuse? It was tolerated. People did not have the code of honor that VMI insists on. And that's a shame on us. But let's take it out of the civilian community and where many of you will go into the U.S. military, and I'll come up with a hypothetical case. You're in a squadron in whatever service. The commanding officer fudges maintenance statistics or the parts required to fly, and it becomes a safety of flight issue. Now you put an individual at risk. Or in a ground scenario, a commanding officer takes completely unnecessary risks in combat, puts the young troops in danger and civilians. Now what we're talking about is not criminal, but rather a life. What does the VMI Code of Honor tell you should do in handling a situation like that? Okay, let me exaggerate the case. What if it's not a life? What if it's tens of thousands of lives that you know are at risk? What do you do? What's honorable? I'll get around to that because we'll talk a moment about Iraq and my experience there. But the theme throughout this session is speaking truth to power. So I hope to spend a little bit of time on that because I think that's what you're most interested in. I will make a comment or two on the civilian-military relationship, and I hope to give you a few teasers on my experience in being revolting, and perhaps set the stage for some questions. Speaking truth to power. I like what Dr. Cohen said. And I would tell you that there are a million different scenarios, and much of it depends on personal relationships. It is an extraordinarily unique circumstance where you would have to make a decision which we would call bet your bars falling on the sword tongue. Most issues involve policy. Most issues involve people making policy decisions that don't have grave consequences. If you have the relationship that we talked about earlier with a senior who is open and receptive, then it's fairly easy. Boss, I think you ought to consider another option. I'd like to think that I created that situation when I was director of operations. I had a personal staff, and I told them, your number one duty is to tell me when the perceptions are such that I ought to change what I'm doing. I'm a one-ball juggler trying to juggle 10, and I need help, and I need you to counsel me, and they did. It was useful. So the atmospherics are important, but what if your boss is not as receptive, or taking extreme, what we call the toxic leader? There are some techniques to use. I'll give you an example of one that I used with Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. I learned it later than I should have, but I'll set the stage. His office in the Pentagon, you go in for a briefing, he invariably was at a stand-up desk, and he would greet you by saying something to set the stage for the outcome of the briefing. And generally it was something like, well, I hope nobody's going to come in here and tell me that we ought to do A, because that would be really stupid of them. That sets a nice tone for giving a briefing. But what I learned, and which worked, was I'd sit down for the briefing and I'd say, Mr. Secretary, you have said this phrase, and we know it's important for us to carry this out. We read you loud and clear. Therefore, and you'd give a briefing that was designed to show them that you're feeding back to him what he wanted. Sometimes it wasn't what he had said at all, but every time he bought into it. What I'm suggesting is don't be confrontational unless you absolutely have to, and I would maintain that those circumstances are so rare as to be almost non-existent. You don't need to be confrontational. You can provide your best counsel to an individual, your senior, civilian or military, in multiple ways. You can say, I know what you would like to achieve, boss, whatever the individual is, in rank or position. I know what you would like to achieve, and I think we can do that. My only counsel is that if we're not careful about this, then the outcome won't be what you want. And you'll find much more receptive. I think the comments that Dave Blankenhorn here made about civil discourse and civil engagement apply. You know, the comment he made about facts, people presented with facts often tend to dig in their heels. If you can change the argument to try and frame the issue in something that'll help the boss achieve what they want, then you'll stand a much better chance of achieving that. But there are occasions, of course, where it is life or death, and we'll come to that. But first, a comment on the civil-military relationship. I personally, in 32 years of active duty and my engagement since in retirement, have never heard uttered in seriousness or in jest a suggestion that the civilian authority is not completely dominant over the military. I don't think it's debatable or debated. I think there are tensions between civilian leadership and the military on occasion, and I think that is inevitable in human nature and dynamics. I think there are tensions in military-to-military relationships. For example, during the Iraq run-up, the tensions between U.S. Central Command, General Franks, and the Joint Staff were much more caustic than the civilian-military relationship was. I think the tension occurs most often in the articulation of strategic objectives and in tactical framework of operations. In my experience through 5 different administrations, presidential administrations, it occurs to me that Americans at that level in national security almost have a genetic flaw that prevents them from thinking strategically. And it's irrespective of party or ideology, but we don't seem to approach crisis with a strategic objective in mind. And I can give you countless examples of that, but I will refer just to one in the Iraq War example. A very good friend of mine is retired General John Abizade, who was the commander of U.S. Central Command, a few times removed from General Peary. A wonderful soldier and leader. He was the Central Command commander when the Iraq War had its toughest period. Secretary Rumsfeld visited him in Iraq, and in his inevitable fashion, greeted General Abizade on the tarmac of the runway and said, "Well, Abizade, when are you going to win this war?" And General Abizade said, when are you going to give me a strategy? But it's not just Secretary Rumsfeld. It's happening today. It's happened in the last administration multiple times. The only exception I've seen was in Bush the Elder with General Scowcroft, and even there were some negative examples, Somalia being one of them. Getting back to the Iraq example and this tension between the strategic and the tactical. As Dr. Cohen talked about, the tension that occurs is not about who is in charge and whether the civilian masters have complete authority to intervene at all levels. They do. It's their prerogative. But how appropriate is it at times? The sizing of the force that went into Iraq changed dramatically from about 500,000. In a meeting in which I gave the briefing, in a casual moment of exasperation, Secretary Rumsfeld said the outside limit is 150,000. Now, where did that number come from, and on what basis of operational wisdom was it arrived? That number, 150,000, at one time was as low as 30,000 to invade a country that must have 12 million people. 2 brigades, 1 Army, 1 Marine. Fortunately, it was restored back to a more sizable number, but it wasn't just in the number of the troops involved. I had a colonel that worked for me, and the director of operations named Mike Scaparati, who is now the 4-star commander of all NATO forces. Wonderful officer. His job was to take a large 3-ring binder full of notes on units that were part of the force list that would go into the invasion. And every week he took it up to Secretary Rumsfeld, who would review every unit going overseas. Bulk Fuel Company, why would we need them? There are too many MPs. Cut the number of MPs. Why do we need military police? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a desperate need at the strategic level for objectives and end state, and to frame the objectives in much the same way that Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Stalin did. And a desperate need not to get so involved in the minutia of what we'll call the tactical level. I had a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense come to me when I was in the Director of Operations. The Secretary of Defense had to approve a 12-man Special Forces team going into one of the stands. And this Deputy Assistant Secretary said, there's some real concern about how casual we are about sending those 12 people into the stands. And I said, okay, we can focus on 12 people going into one of the stands, but we also at the same time have 5,000 tanks and 12,000 artillery pieces and the North Koreans on the border right now in a very tense situation. So set your priorities. Which one do we need to be taking a look at? I illustrate these things only to tell you that in the civil-military tension, there is no debate. The civilian masters have all of the authority and prerogatives. But those that serve long would respectfully request that the focus be at the appropriate level for the national decision makers. Okay. Why did I speak out? I wrote an article in Time magazine, and it was a couple of years after I retired, and I want to set the stage for it first by telling you two quick stories. I want to tell you about Doc Worley and about 3 Marine buddies. I could tell you many more of these, but first, Doc Worley. Doc is a term of affection the Marines apply to the medical corpsmen who serve our units. And it's a very special bond and affection for them. Doc Worley was deployed in Iraq in 2004. He was in the 2nd Humvee in a convoy when they were ambushed. First vehicle was hit very hard, raked. And it was clear that the Marines in that Humvee were not only in very grave danger, but many of them had suffered casualties and some had been killed. Doc Worley jumped out of his vehicle, raced forward, pulling Marines out of that vehicle onto the ground, administering first aid. Doc Worley was hit in the right leg, and hit again, and hit again. He was shot 5 times in the same leg, and he continued to administer to the Marines. Then an RPG was fired and hit next to him and blew off the bottom part of his left leg. Then the Humvee caught on fire, and Doc Worley told me, I figured then it's about time for me to get out of there. The Marines in the second vehicle trying to beat back the ambush then came and pulled Doc Worley out of there. And I was talking to Doc Worley and Walter Reed, where they were trying to save his other leg. And I finished talking to him, and he was there with his wife and his young wife and their very young infant daughter. And I was walking out with his mother, and I said, boy, he seems to be doing well. He is full of vinegar. And his mother said, yeah, but he's having trouble sleeping. I said, well, I can understand that. And she said, no, you don't. The reason he's having trouble sleeping is he's desperate to get back to Iraq to help his Marines because he doesn't know how they're going to make it without him. Second story is about 3 Marines, one of whom I created a friendship with. He had been wounded, was at Bethesda. And I took him out, played golf with him. He invited me back to Walter Reed, where he was transferred. He wanted to meet his buddies. He had 2 buddies there. They were all Marine reservists, called to active duty. All were in college when they were recalled. All were college athletes. This one I met had been the backup quarterback at Eastern Michigan. And I went to meet them, the 3 of them, in this rehab facility. They were working out, pumping weights, making fun of each other, casting aspersions. Might have even been a little profanity thrown in, who knows. Very lively interchange between 3 very close friends. Between the 3 of them, they had 2 legs. Oldest of them was 21 years old. 2 of them were engaged to be married, and the 3rd one was going to wait until he finished college. He had a fiance. Now, why do I bring these stories up? Because loyalty is a pathway up and down. The young enlisted swore an oath to the Constitution, all enemies, foreign and domestic, true faith the same. And they say, I will obey the orders of the President of the United States and the officers appointed over. What they require in response is that what you do show your wisdom and judgment, and their sacrifice is worth what they give. So those 4 people I talked about have no regrets. They would do nothing different. But their expectation is that you will repay their sacrifice with your loyalty. And it's a heavy burden. And sometimes, in the most unusual circumstances, you have to bet your boss. And you have to divert from the 99% rule on speaking out. I'll give you two quotes. The first one is, "It is curious that physical courage is so common and moral courage is so rare." Mark Twain. Second quote is from the individual for whom this building is named, General Marshall, when asked about moral courage and what to do in a difficult situation. He said, "Go straight down the road and do its best, frankly, without equivocation." I hope you're never put in the situation where you have to do what I did. I certainly didn't expect to, didn't want to. Wish I'd never had to be a part of. But don't forget the 20-year-olds and your responsibility to them. But fortunately, your VMI were honor, or another institution were honor and moral courage you're taught, and the standards are high. I congratulate you and envy your position and wish you the best of luck. Thanks.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we have some time for some questions. If you'll come back up to one of the microphones and direct your question to one of our panelists, we'll get started.
They're all leaving.
You're the senior guy, so you should pick the
Questions?
Or I guess he's gonna.
Preston Duff, Virginia Military Institute. This one's actually for General Newbold. From a strategic standpoint, as relates to looking back now at the unstable governance and power instability that we're starting to see over in Iraq from the war we had for Iraqi freedom, what's the importance now of our stake in supporting Saudi Arabia, especially in areas now such as Yemen, Syria, and Libya, as these environments seem to, as Iraq was, be sort of about shroud for a proxy war against Iran, and then as they vie for regional dominance? And also, what would be the true repercussions of us pulling our support out of Saudi Arabia and moving out of the Middle East?
Well, that's a terrific question, so I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Cohen. Hope you don't mind if I stand. I strained my back the other day when I was working out, and sitting like that or standing in one place or uncomfortable. And as thank you. And as many of you know, the first thing that happened when I went to the Pentagon is I had a spinal removal operation, which made back problems. Your question is a great question. I can't contribute to it in a way that will give you great satisfaction. I'll make a couple of comments. I have a good friend named Mattis, whose comments on this align with mine. We've looked at the crises over there too often individually: Yemen, Syria, Libya, certainly Iraq, Iran, etc. We need to extend that to a regional strategy and to a global strategy, because even regional is not sufficient to take into account the tensions among nations and alliances. In the case that you've talked about in Yemen and Saudi Arabia, I think what we have to do is take a long-term view of of our relationship with all of the nations over there, including Iran, and to allow demographics to play out more than we allow them to now. And what I mean by that is that confrontation and, just as Mr. Blankenhorn was talking about it earlier, and as your conference groups are talking about it, civil discourse, that applies at the strategic level as well. We certainly have to create alliances. We have to prevent obnoxious and harmful behavior by people like Iran, but we also have to understand that demographically, Iran's young people will inherit the earth at some point, their country. And that bombast and saber rattling may not be the best course of action on that. Dr. Cohen?
Well, let me actually address in a certain way the first part of your question, and it'll actually be more of a caution for your generation of officers. And that is, the Iraq War was a big, complicated event with lots of different inflection points, some very complicated personalities. And it's going to be an important thing for you to study, and for all of us to study in a detached kind of way, although that's hard if you've had any personal connection to it. The thing I would urge you to be aware of is to turn it into a morality tale. Because when I think about some of the errors that we've made over the last half century or so, I think there's one set that came from treating Vietnam as a certain kind of morality tale, another from treating the first Gulf War as a certain kind of morality tale. This is how you fight wars, and you don't fight them any other way, and you only fight the kind of wars you want to fight. And there's going to be the danger of turning this Iraq War into another kind of morality tale. So that's just more of a kind of a general caution. And I think, by the way, it's going to be your generation which will be able to back off enough to come to something like a balanced understanding of that whole story.
Let me piggyback on what Dr. Cohen said, because he's focused on a really important point here in describing the moral character of some of the things we've done. It's my observation in these various administrations that inevitably there's some tension between pragmatists and ideologues or idealists. And sometimes it's the idealists and the ideologues that put a moral equation onto an international crisis. And it's irrespective of party. It happens on both sides of the aisle. But I would urge people from their experience to learn pragmatically and to not apply the moral to crises in the same way.
I think I'm going to respectfully disagree on that one. I think, first, in general, I think the nature of the United States and the nature of American foreign policy is our values and our interests are always going to be in play. And we have to accept that. And that part of being pragmatic is understanding that. But if you look at something like a Munich, how can you not view that in moral terms? For that matter, if you ask how did George H.W. Bush, who we think of as a sort of realpolitik type, go into what the history of that administration was in the reaction to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, it was a profound and moralistic one on the part of George H.W. Bush. So I take that point, but maybe it's because I'm essentially an historian. I just think our realities are very messy, and part of what education is about is being comfortable with messiness.
Cadet Holden from the Virginia Military Institute. My question is, I can't help but think of H.R. McMaster's book, Dereliction of Duty, with this talk of talking to power right now. And my question is, how similar is the situation in the war in Iraq to the situation that was with the JCS and Secretary of Defense McNamara with President Johnson? And also, how do we prevent that from going forward with, especially now, the military being more and more exclusive from the rest of the citizen side, and kind of in some ways being more detached. I mean, we saw this with Niger, where many of the civilian side of our government had no idea that we were even there, and I mean, it was pretty common knowledge that we were there in the military community.
Well, I'll take the first crack at it this time, then over to General Newbold. So I've known HR since he was a major, actually. And I'll say a couple of things about it. First, that book is very much a young HR. That is to say, a passionate, dedicated young professional who's outraged at his elders' behavior, but to be perfectly frank, hasn't had enough life experience to know, they were in a complicated position as well. I would tell you as an historian, the problem with the book, it is a good book, and he did very sound research for it. It was his doctoral dissertation. The problem with the book is, it is not the case that President Johnson didn't know the Joint Chiefs of Staff's views. He knew. He knew what they wanted. I mean, he documents a number of things they did where you go kind of ick, but it's not the case that if they had spoken up, President Johnson would have said, oh, I had no idea that you believed that. Second problem with the book is, in the Vietnam context, it's not clear the Joint Chiefs had a different way of fighting that war. I took very much to heart what General Newbold said about strategy, but I would say that's not a civilian disease, it's a joint disease.
Agreed.
We don't have many great military strategists either. And basically what the Joint Chiefs came up with was more sooner, but I don't think people really think that that would have changed things. So, it is a good book for what it does, but one shouldn't read too much into it. And it is a book about Vietnam by a passionate, angry, young military officer who's also an apprentice historian. Of course, the irony is he finds himself now in that situation, undoubtedly wondering what the title of the book about him will be. And I'll use that as a segue to General Newbold.
I agree with that. I do think there are a lot of parallels from the perspective of dereliction of duty. I don't know if anybody has read that article I wrote for Time magazine, but my intent in writing that article was really to cascade senior military leadership. It became hijacked, to be honest with you, into an anti-Donald Rumsfeld thing. My criticism was of the Joint Chiefs, the most senior military leaders we had, who in private were either gravely concerned or objected to what was happening, yet would do nothing about it. And in that degree, there are a number of parallels. I think this gives me the opportunity to say, you're disappointed in some people sometimes, but the greatest disappointment are those for whom you have a lot of regard and respect. So I wasn't disappointed with a Doug Feith or a Richard Pearl or Scooter Libby or one of the neocons. They didn't expect much of it, but I was really disappointed when the people who should have known the price the 20-year-olds are going to pay and who had their own grave concerns chose to do nothing.
Thank you.
Sir, Wilson, BMI. This is primarily for Dr. Cohen, but it's asking for a perspective on something that General Newbold said. He said that he wished, respectfully, that civilians do have control of the military and decisions, but that they would provide strategy and sort of stay out of the tactical level. But is there credence to sort of a theory or the saying that it's not the specific leaders that are stuck in the minutia and are toxic, but maybe the political landscape as a whole? So irrespective of who is in control, it's where politics is that forces them to be in there. So sort of like how politics is political and every level has a ramification for that. So whoever the leader is, they don't have the political capital in their day to let a bunch of reservist MPs let Abu Ghraib become a household name. So it's sort of like where you get something like that, where every level there's a reaction that has to take place.
So again, here where there may be a disagreement between us, I'm not sure. I don't think it's right to say, look, civilians, you should do strategy and leave tactics and operations to the military for a couple of reasons. First, there is not a kind of a principled division between big ideas and details. There are details that are important and worth focusing on and making decisions about, and then others that are not. Deploying a dozen soldiers to one of the stands may be a completely trivial decision, unless, maybe the host country isn't cognizant of it, or it implies a further political commitment of some kind. Little things can make a very big difference politically. I mean, I got into one altercation with, we've made it up now, with Admiral McRaven, who basically was calling me a pinstripe bow tie wearing cookie pusher for representing the Secretary of State, saying, no, I don't think we should conduct an operation from country A into country B. And that actually, she'll throw down a red flag on that one and she'll be right. Now you might say, well, this is just it's a little raid, it's the kind of thing we do all the time in country A. Yeah, but the problem is it's in country B. And so in that case, the detail matters. In other cases, it doesn't matter. And I mean, for more, you can read my book, Supreme Command. Conversely, I would say, you can't let the military off the hook on strategy. That's what the civilians expect at the higher level you guys to be good at. If strategy is about matching military means to political ends, well, we better have some people who understand something about military means, actually understand in a lot of depth, talking to the people who are primarily concerned about political ends. So there is a obligation, I think, on the military to be part of that. And the final thing I would say is, my view, again, it's all in the Supreme Command, is it is about dialogue. It is about going back and forth. Now, you got to exercise good judgment, which I don't think Secretary Rumsfeld exercised in that particular case about adjusting the tip fiddle. I mean, why? But asking lots of questions, including about seemingly narrowly military things, absolutely. I'll give you one example, then over to General Newbold. So from my very first trip to Iraq and Afghanistan, I came back and I began asking all my military friends, why is it that we rotate entire divisional headquarters every year? Which is really like giving ourselves a frontal lobotomy every year. Why? Wouldn't it make sense not to go through this cycle where you've got to come up with a brand new campaign plan and pretend that the people before you didn't know what they were doing, which is not true? Why are we doing that? And I have to tell you, I never got a good answer from any of my general officer friends. Now, I was just the counselor of the State Department. I know, pinstripe, bow tie wearing cookie pusher, so nobody really had to address that. But actually, that would have been a great question for a Secretary of Defense to ask and insist on an answer to. In the same way, it was Secretary Gates, let's remember, who's saying, why are we sending kids out in armored Humvees where there are all kinds of vehicles on the market which will be reasonably protected against mines and IEDs and EFPs and all that. And so we get the MRAP. That was because of Secretary Gates. Well, that's a detail, you might say. Why? And maybe Secretary Gates shouldn't be involved in detail, but because of that detail, there are people walking this earth today who otherwise would not be.
I hope it doesn't surprise anybody. I support everything Dr. Cohen has said in that regard. It is entirely appropriate to ask the questions and to challenge. Frankly, senior military needs that kind of challenge to what they're doing. My emphasis here, in addition to what he said, is born out of dismay that we have not often had enough foresight to look at the end state of adventures overseas. And I'll give you a quick example. When I was the brand new director of operations, The Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs was a young lady named Susan Rice, who became the National Security Advisor, many of you recall. There was a crisis in Sierra Leone, where the Revolutionary United Front was greatly endangering the government of that country. And a meeting at the old executive office building, must have been 20 people in the room. I was the only member in uniform. The meeting was really controlled by Susan Rice and a rep from the National Security Council. And Susan Rice made a fervent, passionate pitch that we must send 10,000 troops over there right now. And the meeting was about to wrap up. Nobody looked at me, nobody asked, what about the US military? This makes sense. And I said, well, I have a few questions. I said, what is the Revolutionary United Front? And everybody looked at me like I had a third eye. I said, what's their motivation? What, are they ideologically based? Are they a criminal organization? Are they a religious group? Of course, I knew the answers to these, but I said, unless we can define that and why they are putting themselves through privation and risk of their lives and their families for what they're trying to achieve, what are we going to accomplish? What do we want this to look like when we send troops over there? Why 10,000? Why not 15 or 20 or 5? Composed of what? Are we going to restore the health of the country? Are there needs in food or in healthcare or in government? Are we sending the right people? And for how long? I said, we're ready to send troops over there. We can have them over there quickly. But perhaps we ought to address these questions. And she was not pleased. And the questions weren't answered, and we didn't send troops over there. So, yes, the questions ought to be asked. Deep probing of the military for good cause. But all I'm trying to do is submit a plea for thinking through why we're going to intervene.
If I could just add something, I think it's by way of explanation of how does this happen. So I would not defend Susan Rice. I worked for Condi Rice, much better. But you know, I think back on Deputies Committee meetings, of which I'm sure you had more than your share, on Afghanistan. At the end of the Bush administration, which was a pretty mature administration with well-developed processes and all that, and one of the things that struck me is how much easier it is to talk about inputs. How many soldiers we're going to send, how much aid money, how many diplomats, you know, things which are pretty concrete and you can haggle over, as opposed to asking the question, well, why do we think this will work? Or, you know, to be technical, having a theory of victory. And that's, and again, by the way, that goes to my earlier point about speaking truth to power. If you always go around saying, what is your theory of victory? What is your theory of victory? And people just say, oh, will you please just shut up and go away? But sometimes you have to ask that, and it's quite rare, actually, that that question gets asked.
Good afternoon, Cadet Dewey from VMI. Colonel Andrew Basovich has a theory, he's known as Smedley syndrome, and that's that.
Sorry, could you say that again?
Colonel Andrew Basovich has a theory in his book Breach of Trust about how officers won't speak out against their superiors until they're in positions where upward mobility is no longer a possibility in the military. Have you seen that as to be true? And if so, how would you, what remedy would you offer?
Over to you, sir.
Yes. Okay, next question. I have found that to be true, but let me describe the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the Iraq run-up. They had different motivations for what they did. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was General Richard Myers, Dick Myers. Wonderful human being, nice gentleman. His fervent belief is that his position was not to challenge or even really provide input, but to be a pathway from the combatant commander, in this case U.S. Central Command, to the Secretary of Defense, part of the National Command Authority, and if asked questions, to give advice. That's what he believed. That was his role, so that's what he did. There was another of the Joint Chiefs who was bitterly critical of what was happening in private settings. And he communicated with the U.S. Congress behind the scenes. You'll know who that is. And to the Secretary of Defense, my District General Colin Powell, but wouldn't say a word in the tank, wouldn't say a word to the senior leadership. Now those people had nothing to lose. You know, they weren't going to get promoted again. And there was one of the Joint Chiefs who had been spanked badly by Secretary of Defense and was not about to speak up. And I could go on, but yes, there is something to that. When you reach that level, they're making calculations. And a lot of times it's not ambition. I owe you something in response. The hard question for you in the audience to me is, okay, big boy, you didn't like what was going on. What'd you do about it? And what good is quitting? What does that achieve? It's not known because I don't make it public, but I went to the Commandant of the Marine Corps at the time, and I said, as it became obvious what was going to happen, and I said, okay, I'm ready to resign and retire right now because I see what's coming. And that'll allow you and the Joint Chiefs of Staff to go to the Secretary of Defense and said, we have to have a discussion on what's happening. I would have retired as a one-star, which I was willing to do because it was 5 grades senior what I expected to be. And 6th grade seniors are what everybody else expected me to be. But I was willing to do that. He was not willing to consider, which is a shame. Would it have had any consequence? Probably not. But I thought it was important as a matter of moral conscience for me to do what General Marshall described.
I would just add to that, those very powerful remarks. I commend to all of you a lecture, which is really an essay by C.S. Lewis, the Narnia books and much else, called The Inner Ring, which is a lecture that he gave in 1944 to a bunch of people your age, a bunch of undergraduates at King's College. It's during the war, but it's not about the war. And it's based on his own experience, including as having served in World War I, about how in any organization, there's a formal hierarchy, and then there's the inner ring. And he speaks as a moralist. He says, of all the, he says, why am I going through all this for you? He said, because of all the passions, the passion to be in the inner ring is the most powerful in getting a man who is not yet a very bad man to do some very bad things. And I think you cannot underestimate, when you're in the presence of real power, and that's the cabinet secretary and for sure the president, the desire, to want to see a smile, the desire to want to be included in the next meeting, the desire to be heard, the desire to be in the know. It's a very, very powerful form of seduction. And I think it's worth thinking about that even at this stage in your career.
Time's up right now. Let's please give our two speakers. Gentlemen, thanks so much for sharing your insights and personal experiences which helped us bridge kind of civil military theory with reality. So thank you very much on that. on behalf of the superintendent, the staff and faculty, and the Corps of Cadets, thank you very much for coming today.
Thanks.